In a quiet town like Silver Springs, where neighbors know each other by name, the murder of a beloved resident sends shockwaves through the community. Evelyn Grant, a 40-year-old woman bravely fighting cancer, was found buried in her own front yard, shocking the small town that had once considered itself safe. Her husband, Lucas Grant, and her sister, Natalie Grant, became the central figures in a crime that revealed hidden betrayals and deep emotional turmoil. As details of their affair and the tragic confrontation emerged, the community grappled with the reality of the betrayal from within. How could a loving family turn to violence against one of their own? The Grants appeared to be close-knit, like many others in the small, quiet town. Evelyn Grant, the heart of the family, was a 40-year-old woman admired for her grace and kindness. She was the kind of person who always had a smile for everyone, even as she faced the toughest battle of her life, cancer. Standing by her side through it all was her younger sister, Natalie Grant. Natalie, just 2 years younger than Evelyn, was caring and deeply supportive. The bond between the two sisters had always been strong, but it grew even closer as Evelyn's illness progressed. Natalie was there for every difficult doctor's visit, every long night in the hospital. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant, Evelyn's husband of 15 years, found himself in an entirely different struggle. At 42, Lucas was a man who had always prided himself on being a dependable husband and provider. But the emotional weight of his wife's illness was taking its toll. Evelyn Grant's life changed forever the day she was diagnosed with cancer. What began as a routine visit to the doctor quickly spiraled into something far more serious. The news hit the Grant family hard. Evelyn suddenly found herself facing the fight of her life. The cancer was aggressive, and treatment would be tough, but Evelyn, always strong and kind-hearted, was determined to face it with grace. She started chemotherapy almost immediately, entering a world of hospital rooms, doctor's appointments, and medications that left her feeling weaker by the day. The constant exhaustion kept her from doing the things she once loved, from being the wife she wanted to be. And as her focus narrowed to fighting her illness, she didn't see the growing distance between herself and her husband, Lucas. Lucas was there for her at the beginning. He attended doctor's appointments, held her hand during treatments, and did his best to keep the household running. But as the months wore on, the burden of being Evelyn's caretaker started to weigh heavily on him. He wasn't just dealing with the stress of managing a household. He was watching his wife, the woman he had loved for so long, slip away from him, both physically and emotionally. At first, he tried to stay strong, telling himself that he could handle it, that things would get better. But the strain of illness has a way of revealing cracks in even the strongest foundations. Lucas began to feel trapped by the daily routine of caregiving. He became frustrated with the illness, with Evelyn's inability to get better, and ultimately with himself for not being able to fix the situation. As Evelyn's condition worsened, so did Lucas's resentment. He missed the woman Evelyn used to be, and that longing for normalcy slowly turned into emotional detachment. He was still there physically, but emotionally, he began to pull away. At first, he tried to stay positive, supporting his wife through every doctor's visit and each round of chemotherapy. But the longer the fight dragged on, the harder it became for Lucas to keep his own feelings at bay. Evelyn's illness was taking a heavy toll on him, and it wasn't just the physical exhaustion of being her caregiver, it was the emotional weight that wore him down. Lucas found it harder to talk to Evelyn. She was focused on surviving, on getting through each painful day, and Lucas felt like an outsider in his own marriage. He felt guilty for wanting more than what their life had become. But the guilt didn't stop the resentment from building. In the midst of this emotional turmoil, Lucas found solace in an unexpected place: Evelyn's sister, Natalie. Natalie had been by their side from the beginning, helping care for Evelyn and offering support whenever it was needed. But as Evelyn's health deteriorated, Natalie became more than just a helping hand. She became the one person Lucas could talk to, someone who seemed to understand what he was going through in a way that Evelyn, consumed by her own battle, couldn't. Natalie became Lucas's emotional crutch. She was there when he needed to vent his frustrations or just escape from the crushing weight of his responsibilities. Natalie listened when Lucas talked about how helpless he felt, how much he missed the way things used to be. She didn't judge him for his anger or frustration. Instead, she offered understanding, and that was something Lucas hadn't felt in a long time. Gradually, Lucas began to rely on Natalie more and more. She was a source of comfort, someone who could provide what he felt was missing in his marriage to Evelyn. What started as simple support slowly deepened into something far more complicated. Natalie became the person Lucas turned to, not just to help care for Evelyn, but to fill the emotional void that had opened up between him and his wife. Lucas, overwhelmed by his frustrations and helplessness, found himself leaning on Natalie more than ever. Natalie, caught between her love for her sister and her growing feelings for Lucas, couldn't pull away. Together they crossed a line that would forever change their lives, and Evelyn's. It wasn't a single moment that led to the affair, but a series of small, intimate exchanges that blurred the boundaries between them. At first, it was the late-night conversations, whispered talks about their shared stress, fears, and frustrations as Evelyn's condition worsened. Natalie would stay late after helping with Evelyn's care, and once Evelyn went to bed, the two of them would sit together, sometimes in silence, sometimes venting about how hard things had become. There was an unspoken understanding between them that they were both struggling, and in that struggle, they found comfort in each other. But as time passed, their emotional connection deepened into physical attraction. One night, in a moment of weakness, they gave in to that attraction. The guilt hit them both immediately after, but instead of pulling away, they fell deeper into the affair. It wasn't just the physical aspect that drew them closer, it was the sense of escape. With each stolen kiss, each secret moment, Lucas and Natalie found a refuge from the pain and weight of Evelyn's illness. But as their secret relationship grew, so did the strain on their consciences. Natalie felt the crushing weight of guilt. She was betraying her own sister, a woman who trusted her more than anyone else in the world. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. The more they tried to convince themselves it was only temporary, that it didn't mean anything, the more they became entangled in each other's lives. Meanwhile, Evelyn was becoming more isolated than ever. The chemotherapy was taking a serious toll on her, leaving her physically and emotionally drained. Once a lively and independent woman, she now spent most of her days resting, struggling just to get through each day. Evelyn was aware that something was wrong in her marriage, but she thought it was the strain of her illness. She believed Lucas was simply stressed and distant because of the burden of caring for her. She could feel the emotional gap widening between them, but she never suspected that it was because of Natalie. It was an ordinary morning when Evelyn Grant left her house for what was supposed to be another exhausting day of chemotherapy. She had prepared herself mentally, knowing how drained she would feel afterward, but determined to keep fighting. Lucas kissed her goodbye, and Natalie had promised to come by later, as she often did, to help out around the house. Evelyn had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong, that her life, already burdened by illness, was about to unravel in the most devastating way. But fate took a different turn that day. When Evelyn arrived at the hospital, she was told that her chemotherapy session had been postponed due to a scheduling issue. It was a rare break in the grueling routine she had come to expect. With nothing else to do, she decided to head back home earlier than planned, looking forward to a quiet afternoon of rest. When Evelyn entered the house, it was quiet, almost eerily so. She noticed Lucas's car in the driveway, but assumed he was working from home. Natalie was nowhere to be seen, and Evelyn guessed she might have gone out for errands. She walked slowly through the house, feeling the exhaustion already creeping back into her bones. It wasn't until she reached the bedroom that she noticed something was off. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear faint voices inside. Puzzled, Evelyn pushed the door open, and what she saw stopped her cold. There, in her own bed, were Lucas and Natalie, tangled together in a moment of intimacy that shattered the very foundation of her world. The shock hit Evelyn like a physical blow. For a second, she couldn't even speak, the image in front of her almost too impossible to process. When they saw her, the color drained from their faces. Lucas jumped up, scrambling to cover himself, while Natalie looked equally horrified, her eyes wide with guilt. "What? What is this?" Evelyn stammered, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock, hurt, and disbelief. Lucas tried to explain, to come up with words that might ease the situation, but there was nothing he could say that would make the reality any less cruel. Natalie, too, was frozen, unable to meet her sister's eyes. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of their guilt and Evelyn's devastation. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Evelyn, though weakened by her illness, found a surge of strength fueled by her anger and hurt. She demanded answers, her voice shaking with emotion as she lashed out at both Lucas and Natalie. The pain in her eyes was unmistakable. How could they do this to her, especially now when she was at her most vulnerable? Lucas, unable to face the consequences of his actions, stammered out excuses, trying to justify what could never be justified. He spoke of frustration, of how hard it had been watching her suffer, of how he had felt neglected. But every word only deepened the betrayal. Natalie, still too shocked to speak, stood in the corner, tears streaming down her face, knowing that nothing she could say would undo the damage. Evelyn, shattered by what she had discovered, threatened to expose them, and in their twisted logic, they felt there was no way out. The fear of their affair being revealed and the consequences it would bring pushed them to a place of desperation. They made a decision in the heat of the moment, one that would forever stain their lives. They decided that Evelyn had to be silenced. The murder itself was swift, brutal, and fueled by panic. In the quiet of the Grant home, the horror unfolded. Lucas, driven by fear and frustration, was the one to strike first. He grabbed a pillow from the bed, the same bed where their secret had been uncovered, and pressed it over Evelyn's face. Natalie watched, frozen at first, as her sister struggled beneath the weight of the pillow. The sight of Evelyn's hands, weak and frail from months of chemotherapy, clawing at Lucas in a desperate attempt to breathe, was a haunting image that would stay with Natalie forever. For a moment, Evelyn fought back, her body writhing in terror as she tried to escape. But she was no match for Lucas's strength. Natalie, in her guilt and confusion, stepped forward, and instead of stopping the horrific act, she helped hold Evelyn down. The two of them, together, extinguished the life of a woman who had loved and trusted them both. The room was filled with the sounds of their struggle, the heavy breathing of Lucas, the quiet gasps of Natalie, and the fading breaths of Evelyn. As Evelyn's body grew still, the gravity of what they had done settled in. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. The ultimate betrayal had been committed, not just against Evelyn, but against everything they once were. They had murdered someone they loved, someone who had done nothing but trust them. In that moment, they weren't just killers. They had destroyed their own humanity. The affair, the lies, the guilt, it all seemed trivial compared to the weight of the life they had just taken. In the hours that followed, panic set in. Lucas and Natalie, now bound together by their unspeakable crime, had to figure out what to do next. They couldn't let anyone find out. The reality of what they had done hung over them, and they scrambled to come up with a plan to hide the truth. The first decision was to hide the body. They couldn't risk anyone finding Evelyn inside the house. Under the cover of darkness, Lucas and Natalie carried Evelyn's lifeless body out into the backyard. The earth was still soft from recent rain, and they began to dig a shallow grave. With each shovel full of dirt, Natalie's guilt deepened, but she kept going, driven by the fear of being caught. They buried Evelyn in the very yard where she had once gardened, where she had found peace in the little moments of life before the illness took hold. Now, it was her final resting place, hidden beneath the ground by the two people who should have protected her most. Once the body was buried, Lucas and Natalie tried to return to normal, pretending that nothing had happened. They crafted a false story about Evelyn's absence, telling friends and neighbors that she had gone to a special treatment facility for her cancer. In a small town like Silver Springs, people believed them. After all, everyone knew how hard the battle with cancer could be. It wasn't uncommon for someone to leave town for more advanced care. For a while, their lie worked, but the weight of the crime was too much to bear. As the days passed, Natalie began to crack under the pressure. The guilt gnawed at her. She couldn't sleep, her mind replaying the moment of the murder over and over again. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Evelyn's face, twisted in fear, her hands desperately reaching out for help that never came. The sound of her sister's fading breaths echoed in her ears, a constant reminder of the horror she had taken part in. Lucas, on the other hand, tried to keep the facade going. He convinced himself that they had done what they had to do, that there was no other way. But even he couldn't completely escape the tension. His temper grew shorter, his nerves more frayed. Any small reminder of Evelyn's presence, a piece of her clothing, a photo on the wall, seemed to taunt him, reminding him of what he had done. Mrs. Jenkins had lived in Silver Springs for decades, a quiet observer of the small town's comings and goings. The elderly woman lived alone with her dog, Max, who she walked every day through the peaceful neighborhood. It was during one of these routine walks that everything began to unravel. On that fateful morning, Max wandered into the Grants' front yard, sniffing around the recently disturbed soil near the flower bed. At first, Mrs. Jenkins didn't think much of it. But when Max began digging furiously, barking as if he'd found something, she felt uneasy. Curious and concerned, she approached the spot where Max had uncovered a strange, foul-smelling patch of earth. She bent down to take a closer look and saw something that made her blood run cold, a glimpse of what looked like a human finger buried just beneath the surface. Alarmed, she hurried back home and called the police. What Max had found would soon shock the entire town. The discovery of Evelyn Grant's body in her own yard sent waves of horror through the small, close-knit community. Silver Springs was a place where everyone knew each other, where secrets were hard to keep. But no one could have imagined that such a gruesome crime had been hiding in plain sight. The news spread quickly, and within hours, neighbors gathered outside the Grant home, murmuring in disbelief. Evelyn had been a beloved figure in the town, known for her kindness and strength as she battled cancer. Now, the horrifying truth was out. Evelyn hadn't disappeared for more treatment. She had been murdered, buried by the very people who should have been caring for her. As the police arrived at the scene, Detective Sam Rodriguez took charge of the investigation. Rodriguez was a seasoned detective, known for his sharp mind and methodical approach to solving cases. Nothing escaped his attention. When he heard that Evelyn's body had been found in the front yard, he knew this was no ordinary crime. There were too many questions. Why had she been buried here, so close to home? And who would want to harm a woman already fighting for her life? Rodriguez began his investigation by carefully examining the scene, noting the disturbed soil, the placement of the body, and the surrounding area. It was clear to him that this was a rushed burial, likely done in a panic. The Grant house, once a symbol of a happy family, was now the epicenter of a murder investigation. Rodriguez knew he needed to get inside the minds of those who lived there, Lucas and Natalie. When Rodriguez first questioned Lucas and Natalie, they stuck to their story about Evelyn going away for treatment. But something didn't sit right with him. He noticed the tension between them, the way Natalie avoided eye contact and how Lucas's answers felt rehearsed. As he dug deeper, Rodriguez began to uncover subtle inconsistencies in their timeline. Lucas mentioned things that didn't add up, like specific dates and details that seemed oddly vague for a man whose wife had supposedly just left for medical care. Natalie, on the other hand, was visibly rattled during her interview. Rodriguez could sense that she was carrying a heavy burden, and it was only a matter of time before the weight of her guilt would cause her to slip. He asked her about her relationship with Evelyn, about the day she had last seen her, and Natalie stumbled through her answers. The cracks in her story were beginning to show. Rodriguez was patient, taking note of every inconsistency, every nervous glance between Lucas and Natalie. He had seen it before, people who thought they could hide the truth but eventually broke under pressure. He continued to piece together the puzzle, focusing on the subtle clues that pointed to something much darker than just a missing person. Neighbors had mentioned seeing strange behavior at the Grant house in the weeks leading up to Evelyn's disappearance. And Mrs. Jenkins, always the observant neighbor, had even noticed that Natalie had been visiting far more often than usual. It all pointed to a deeper, more sinister motive. Detective Rodriguez knew something was off from the moment he began questioning Natalie. Her nervousness, her trembling hands, and the way her voice wavered whenever she spoke about Evelyn, it all told him that she was on the verge of breaking. And then, one evening, unable to carry the burden any longer, Natalie walked into the police station, pale and shaking. She asked to speak with Rodriguez. Sitting across from him, her voice barely above a whisper, she said the words that would finally bring the truth to light. "We killed her. We killed Evelyn." The confession poured out of her in a flood of tears and remorse. Natalie told the detective everything, how she and Lucas had begun an affair, how they were caught in the act by Evelyn, and how, in their desperation, they chose to silence her forever. She described the murder in chilling detail, the horror of holding down her own sister, the frantic burial, and the constant, gnawing guilt that had followed them ever since. It was a moment of both deep tragedy and release. Natalie could no longer live with the weight of her crime, and in confessing, she hoped to find some sense of closure. After Natalie's confession, it didn't take long for the police to arrest both her and Lucas. The arrest sent shockwaves through Silver Springs. Lucas Grant, once seen as the loving husband devastated by his wife's illness, and Natalie, the supportive sister, were now known as cold-blooded killers. The image of their happy, close-knit family was shattered. As the handcuffs clicked around their wrists, the community stood in stunned disbelief. Neighbors gathered outside the Grant house as police cars lined the street, watching in silence as Lucas and Natalie were led away. The town was consumed by a mix of sorrow and outrage. How could something so horrific happen here, in this quiet town where everyone knew each other? Evelyn had been a beloved member of the community, known for her kindness and bravery as she faced cancer. Her death was tragic enough, but the revelation that her own husband and sister were behind it left Silver Springs reeling. The betrayal was deep, personal, and incomprehensible. For Lucas and Natalie, the consequences were swift and severe. Both were sentenced to long prison terms, their lives now defined by the crime they had committed. Lucas, once a successful and respected man, was now a shell of his former self, sitting behind bars, haunted by the decisions that had destroyed not only his wife's life, but his own. Natalie, too, was consumed by remorse, constantly replaying the events in her mind, wishing she could take it all back. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no undoing the irreversible choices they had made. Evelyn's funeral became a somber gathering where friends and neighbors shared stories about her warmth and generosity, struggling to make sense of how her life had ended in such a senseless, brutal way. The grief that hung over the town was heavy, as was the realization that the people responsible for her death were not strangers, but family. The impact of the crime rippled through Silver Springs, leaving the town forever changed. In a place where trust and closeness had always been a source of pride, this act of violence shattered the community's sense of safety. Evelyn's murder wasn't just the loss of a life, it was the loss of innocence in a town that had always believed it was safe from such darkness. In a town where trust had been shattered, the nights now felt heavy with the promise of secrets still buried and the lingering question of whether the past could ever truly be left behind.